How's everybody today? You were supposed to be working this week on an analysis of the chapter on Thomas Aquinas, and we're not going to go into a detailed analysis of that, obviously. That's one of the reasons why we've given you this assignment. But we still have to understand that when we turn to the Reformation, it is after a long period of the impact of Thomas Aquinas on the history of Christian ethics. Thomas Aquinas basically begins with a concept of virtue and natural law, which the Reformers find to be too non-Christian, too pagan, too much dependent on reason than on revelation. From Thomas Aquinas' perspective, of course, he believes that in talking about God or in talking about ethics, you first do your reasoning based on nature. And then revelation completes nature. Supernature completes nature. So he begins with in ethics, he begins with the concept of God, with the idea that God is one, that God exists and that He is one. But he doesn't believe you can learn anything else besides about God except that by natural reason. So then it's by revelation that you learn all of the other things about God that Christians believe. In the same way, you begin in ethics with reason, and you can therefore affirm the basic virtues that even the pagans or non-Christians affirmed. For instance, he talks about the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And then he analyzes those in great depth. And those are things that you don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to have heard the gospel. You don't have to have heard the story of Jesus or the Bible in order to be to analyze and to, in a sense, live your life in accordance with these four cardinal virtues. On the other hand, there are the supernatural virtues, or the theological virtues, of faith, hope, and love. And of course, that list comes from the Apostle Paul in in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And faith, hope, and love are not things that can be derived from reason. Just like real knowledge of God cannot be derived from reason. And since Christian ethics is based on knowledge of God, you have to have some knowledge of God to understand the importance of faith, the importance of hope, and the importance of love. Well, even some of the earlier Christian theologians had talked about the pagan virtues as vices. Well, what did they mean by that? Well, they didn't mean that there wasn't anything good or substantial about the pagan virtues, but that they did not lead to the completion of human life, because human life can only be completed in relationship to the one who created human life and who gives human life its telos, or its goal. And so Thomas Aquinas is kind of keeping that tradition. That is, human life obviously has natural aspects of it. All human beings have something inside them that tells them, or at least gives them the possibility of recognizing the existence and the majesty of God. And everyone has inside them the possibility of understanding the telos, or what the reason for human creation is. Now, one of the implications, or one of the ramifications of Aristotelian ethics for our modern discussion of ethics is that a great deal of the discussion going on even today in American political and philosophical thought is a discussion that is based on natural law. For instance, the Roman Catholic position on contraception and on abortion is rooted in the Aristotelian, in fact, the Thomistic conception of natural law. It's not completely based in that, but that's where its root is. In other words, a Roman Catholic who believes that there is a kind of a natural law universal among human beings just cannot imagine how anyone can come up with the idea that ending the life of a fetus that has already begun can be considered to be natural and therefore ethical. Because when a fetus has begun to live, it has a potential, which is an Aristotelian idea. It has a potential. It is not a full-fledged human being. A 1-year-old child is not a full-fledged human being. But from the perspective of natural law, the Roman Catholic Church assumes that even human law or positive law should protect the life of a fetus, and that deciding that the end of a fetal life can take place at some kind of arbitrary moment actually cuts off the potentiality of that human life. So it's too simple to say, well, when does life begin? There's a sense in which life began a long time ago, and there's no particular point at which life begins. Life operates on the basis of natural law, in that when human beings fulfill their sexual duties, life is produced. An individual life is produced. But that is not the beginning of life. Life already existed in the sperm and the egg before an individual life came about. But anyway, the potential from the perspective of natural law is always there. So it just does not compute to a natural law person that you can cut off that life just because it's still in the womb, any more than you can cut it off ethically after it is outside the womb. So that's part of the discussion going on even in modern terms. And there are two Supreme Court justices who are kind of experts on natural law, Clarence Thomas and Justice Scalia. Both talk a great deal in some of their philosophical writings about natural law. So from their perspective, even though they are made Supreme Court justices and their primary job is to interpret the American Constitution, they still, in the back of their mind, have a conception of a higher law. And in this case, the higher law is natural law. And they, therefore, will have a tendency to vote in a way similar to, say, the Roman Catholic ethic would require them to. Not because it's Roman Catholic ethic, but because, from their perspective, it's a kind of an obvious derivation of natural law. When we move to Luther and Calvin, the Protestant Reformation burst on the scene in the early 16th century, breaking the medieval world apart and recasting the religious and political map of Europe. Now, that just is a statement of the political impact of the Reformation, but of course, in terms of Christian ethics, that was really the primary motivation of the Reformation, was theological and ethical. Luther wasn't that interested in political philosophy. He wasn't that interested in politics, though he does have an ethic of political life, and he has an ethic of social life. But his main problem with Aristotle was not particularly the way he thought about politics. The main problem with Aristotle was the way he thought about God, and the way he thought about how God was related to the world. Luther, in his little treatise called Christian Liberty, says, We are not saved by works, nor by the laws that command them. We are saved by faith. The Christian is free from all things. Such a person needs no works in order to be justified and saved, but receives these gifts in abundance from faith alone. Now, what Luther is reacting to is what he considers to be a whole period in church history in which salvation is understood as works righteousness, or as the result of working. Whether it's the result of working in a legalistic sense or even the result of working in a cooperative sense. From Luther's perspective, you've got the cart before the horse. And this, therefore, has a great deal to do with ethics. In fact, sometimes the critique of Luther is that he doesn't really have an ethic. He just has a doctrine of justification or a doctrine of salvation. And therefore, it doesn't make any difference to Luther what a person does, right or wrong, because his salvation is absolutely determined by his faith. And that's true, except that's a misunderstanding of what Luther is trying to say. If you mean by that Luther is not interested in ethics, because Luther does have a place for the law, for moral rules and moral ethics, but the place is kind of switched. In medieval Catholic ethics, just like in Aristotelian ethics, in a sense, if you know what to do, you will do it. Luther begins with the same assumption that the Apostle Paul and Augustine began with, and that is, it's not hard to know what to do, but it's impossible for fallen human beings to do it. So for Aristotle, for instance, ethics goes like this. Act precedes being. That is, you act, you get into the habit of doing what is right. You know what is right, you get in the habit of doing what's right, and that will make you good. Act precedes being. Luther switches that. And in direct criticism of Thomism and Aristotelianism says that being precedes act. In other words, you cannot become good simply by trying to do good and getting into the habit of doing good. Habit is an important word in Aristotle and in Aquinas. And the scriptural reference for this idea, first of all, is the Pauline conception of justification, or being made righteous by faith rather than by works. In other words, you can't wait till you work up enough righteousness to be saved. You first have to be saved before you are put into a position where you can be righteous or do righteousness. And another source of this idea is Jesus talking about a tree. An evil tree cannot produce good fruit. A corrupt tree cannot produce good fruit. Only a good tree can produce good fruit. So the being has to precede the act. A human being has to be good before they can do good. Now you have to understand that Luther did not believe, did not have a doctrine like Wesley later had of perfection. So from Luther's perspective, human beings, even if they were saved, were never going to cease being sinful. They had just been taken out. They had been born again. They had been created anew. They were now a new creation. So now they were in a position to be and to do what God wanted them to be. But they couldn't accomplish that by studying ethics and studying the law and then putting the law into effect. The primary question addressed by Christian ethics thus ought not to be the consideration of works or moral precepts. And that's what all natural ethics is. You begin by consideration of moral precepts. Rather, it should be a consideration of the moral will itself. What is the status of the human will? There is nothing, that is, no thing, that's in and of itself evil. But what can be corrupted is the will, is the moral will of the human being. And from Luther's perspective, the moral will of the human being is corrupted, and it is bound by our fallen nature. We are not good because of the good things we do. The things we do are good because we are good. That is, we have been made good. There's a great deal of misunderstanding still in American culture, European culture, even among intellectuals and academics, that Christianity is the view, or the basic Christian view of human nature is that human beings are essentially evil. In fact, we're going to talk about John Calvin in just a minute. And John Calvin had a concept which is sometimes called total depravity. And a lot of modern people think total depravity means that human beings are essentially evil. That is not what total depravity means. John Calvin, just like Martin Luther, just like Augustine, just like Paul, just like Jesus, just like the prophets of the Old Testament, just like the author of Genesis, believe that human beings are essentially good. If they were not essentially good, they could not be redeemed. You can only redeem something that is essentially good. If human beings are essentially good, then you already have your answer as to why human beings are. If you believe that human beings are essentially evil, then you already have your answer to the reason why human beings are the way they are. If you believe that human beings are essentially good, then you have to have something like or equivalent to the Christian doctrine of sin. Because the Christian doctrine of sin has meaning only if you believe that human beings are essentially good. Now that's a simple idea, but it's a bad misunderstanding among lots of people, including lots of intellectuals in the modern world, that the doctrine of sin means that Christians believe that human beings are essentially evil. That's not what sin means. What sin means is that Christians believe that human beings are good, but they are fallen. And total depravity, I'm not necessarily defending the doctrine of total depravity, but I'm trying to explain what it is. Total depravity does not mean that we are totally and absolutely corrupt. What total depravity means is that all aspects of our existence are tainted by corruption. One of the problems is that the word depravity has a more modern meaning. When we talk about somebody being depraved, we're talking about a real slime ball, And so none of us wants to think about ourselves as depraved, as a slime ball who has no redeeming value and cannot be redeemed. Well, if that's what Aquinas meant by depravity, then of course I would have to agree with the critique of the idea. But the idea is that all human beings, even though they are essentially good, have been affected and tainted by the fall. So every aspect of them, their will, their feelings, their emotions, their intellect. So you can't be saved either by your will, by your emotions or feelings, or by your intellect. There is nothing in you that has the power to save you. There is nothing in you that has the power to make you good. There may not be anything in you to make you good, even if there is no God. But in that case, we're just in trouble. The fact of the matter is, from the Christian perspective, that there is nothing in you that gives you the power to become good, but you are still not lost because of that, because God has the power to make you good. And so if you are in relationship to God, then you can be good. Your goodness is still, as long as we're in this world, your goodness is still tainted by some element of self-interest and so forth. So that's the reason why Luther said something. I have a T-shirt at home that was given to me by a theologian that we had on the campus here a few years ago. And it's a quotation from Luther. Sin boldly, but believe more boldly. Now, one of the problems with Luther is that he talks in exaggerated terms in order to try to get across the point. He wasn't recommending that you go out and sin. What he was saying was, when you go out, you're going to sin. And so what you need to do is to believe more boldly. In other words, your faith in God gives you a contact by which even your sin that you're involved in inevitably because of your fallen nature can be overcome. Now that is a complex ethic. It's a radical ethic. It's not an ethic of law and rules. Law and rules are much simpler. You can say the Ten Commandments, for instance, is a rule that says you shall not commit adultery. Jesus' ethic is a little bit more complex. He says, for instance, that if you long to mistreat a woman in your heart, you have already committed adultery. He says if you have a real desire to hurt someone else in your heart, you've already committed murder. Well, that means that what Jesus is saying is that sin is not something that I do one day and keep from doing the next. It's not something that you do one week and I do it the next week. Sin is something that characterizes all human life and all human effort, which is the reason why human beings cannot save themselves. Now that doesn't mean that everybody is desperately slime, or desperately depraved. But it does mean that everybody is a sinner. There is a difference between my son and Jeffrey Dahmer, you know, if you're looking at it from a human perspective. Jeffrey Dahmer killed people and ate them. Well, my son doesn't do that. So I objectively speaking, consider my son to be a good man. I also know that he's a sinner, though, in terms of Christian ethics, in that he is a good person from the perspective of the fact that he is the creation of God. And that his being completed, or being perfected, or being saved spiritually and ethically is not going to be on the basis of his own goodness. It's going to be on the basis of his relationship with God and his relationship to other people are going to be based on that. So from Luther's perspective then, a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. So you can't produce a good tree by producing good fruit. You can only produce good fruit if you have a good tree. And in order to have a good tree, that tree has to be, in a sense, recommissioned. It has to be reoriented. It has to be The biblical expressions are born again, and that's an expression which has all kinds of negative meanings for us today. In fact, a lot of these terms have negative meanings that are really unrelated to their original meaning. The word sin has a concept, people have a concept of what sin is today that makes it very difficult for them to understand what sin means in Christian theology. Because we think, well, Christians believe that everybody else is sinner. They're Christians and then they're sinners. Or they're saints and then they're sinners. That's not what Christianity believes about sin. Christianity believes that all human beings participate in sin. Therefore, all human beings are sinners. So if a person is a Christian, that doesn't mean that he ceases being a sinner. He is now a sinner who is justified or redeemed or saved by the goodness and the grace and the righteousness of God, not by his own righteousness. Now, for a lot of people, that's too pessimistic a view of human nature. But it's not nearly as pessimistic a view of human nature as has resulted from some of the more, trying to put into place some of the more optimistic views of human nature. For instance, Marxism is a kind of an optimistic view of human nature. It believes that humans by themselves can become righteous and produce the kingdom of God on earth. But then just read the history of the Soviet Union, or the history of Cambodia, or the history of Maoism in China. That doesn't sound much like the kingdom of God on earth. So having a optimistic view of human nature doesn't necessarily produce good. Having a pessimistic view of human nature also will not produce good. You know, you read about Schopenhauer. Having a pessimistic view of human nature does not produce good. That's the reason why the Christian view of human nature and the Christian view of human sin is generally called Christian realism. That is, it's not optimistic. You can't read the newspaper and be optimistic about human nature. But it's also not totally pessimistic. If there is no help from beyond, then it should be pessimistic. But Christianity believes that there is help from beyond. And therefore you cannot be pessimist. You cannot be a pessimist about human nature if you're a Christian. You also cannot be an optimist about human nature if you're a Christian. So, we give this rule, Luther says, the good things which we have from God ought to flow from one to another and become common to all, so that every one of us may, as it were, put on his neighbor. In other words, we're not isolated individualists. Christianity is not an isolated individualism. If we have received good things from God, that should flow in our relationship to everyone else. We should put on our neighbor. That's another way of talking about real Christian community. So that every one of us may, as it were, put on his neighbor so behave towards him as if he were himself in his place. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All of these are kind of different ways of describing the fact that from the Christian perspective, you have received forgiveness and good things from God. You didn't generate them yourselves. You have received them from God. And so you owe them to other people. But there is the problem of the two kingdoms which Martin Luther developed. Because all who are not Christians belong to the kingdom of the world and are under the law. There is a need for law. And Luther divides God's government of the world into two kingdoms. From Luther's perspective, human government is also one of God's kingdoms. But it obviously cannot be a kingdom like the kingdom of God, properly so called. Because the kingdom of God, properly so called, is made up of the people who are under the power and the motivation of God's love and God's grace. That means that most people, including, by the way, Luther says, a large number of people who are in the church. You know, Augustine made the point that you can't tell whether a person is really a Christian just because he's in the church. The modern word for Christian is that anybody who's a member of the Christian church is a Christian. But of course, that is a sociological definition of the word Christian, a statistical definition of the word Christian. That is not a theological definition of the word Christian. So from Luther's perspective, even most people in the church need the second kingdom, that is the law or the government, to keep them from killing one another. And in Luther's more honest moments and his more consistent moments, he would say that everybody in the church still needs the government. Because even as good as we think we are, sometimes our own self-interest will lead us to do things that are not in the interest of other people, and that's the reason why you have to have laws to keep you from trespassing on the interests of other people. Evil in this world must be restrained. It is no act of love to fail to resist evil. In the early church, you remember, the early Christians were pacifists. They had no stake in what the police did. They had no stake in what the government did. But even then, they recognized the government as a servant of God. That is, that the government did the work of God by keeping people, even people who weren't Christians, but also even Christians, if they fell into this category, from hurting one another and from killing one another. A Christian community should be a place where you don't need to call the police very often. But sometimes you need to call the police even in a Christian community. Because you need to protect others, not to protect yourself. Now, I have a hard time being a pacifist in this original sense. You know, I would probably have the tendency to dial 911 if somebody started beating me up. But even these older theologians made a very clear distinction between resisting evil yourself personally, particularly showing vengeance personally, and resisting evil when it's done to others. And from their perspective, that's the only justification for police. But since there is justification for police and armies, if they're just, then Luther said, you as a Christian can participate in them yourself. In other words, you can't be involved in resistance of evil against yourself personally, but you can be involved in the resistance of evil against other people, because that's showing love to other people. And that's how that idea developed. Now, obviously, the development of these ideas, like the two kingdoms, never work the way the original thinkers think they should. Because people who accept the idea that police and armies are legitimate for the protection of the neighbor don't always limit the use of police and armies to the protection of the neighbor. When you give a policeman power, you have to watch him. When you give an army power, you have to watch them, because police are just like any other sinners. They will have the tendency sometimes to act in their own self-interest. and according to their own prejudices, and so on. In fact, one of the things I was talking before the class, one of the things that I would like to see some people focus on in terms of our debate at the last of the class period, or in the last class of this series, because the debate that we had planned has kind of been taken away from us because the book that we ordered for that debate is not available. What worries me most right now in terms of ethics in America is our criminal justice system. Because the longer I live, the more people I get involved with who are the victims of our criminal justice system. And people are not supposed to be victims of the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is supposed to protect victims. But quite often, American people are victims of our criminal justice system because of their race, because of their economic status, because of their cultural or other kinds of status, or just because people who get these jobs operate on the basis of legalisms and do not pay attention to the fact that they're dealing with human beings. So, when Luther talked about the two kingdoms, he didn't mean that when a Christian became a policeman, he was an entirely different person from when he was a Christian, because he is both a kingdom of God person and a kingdom of this world person. But a policeman or a governor or a president should be able to summon up a little bit of empathy, a little bit of compassion, a little bit of forgiveness, even in his execution of laws. And some of the people who are making me the most angry while I watch television these days, everybody's mad at defense lawyers because they think defense lawyers do some bad things, and there's no doubt about that because every one of them are sinners. But what is angering me most these days is the insensitivity of prosecuting attorneys. They blame the law on things that they could make judgments about, giving a little compassion and so forth. But some prosecuting attorneys run on the basis that they are hard-nosed and they will put anybody's butt in jail that they can get hold of. And so to me that is an important ethical problem that we're now dealing with, especially in light of the fact that America has more people in jail than any other civilized country except the Soviet Union and South Africa. And a large percentage of our young people are in jail. And a large percentage of them are in jail because they've been guilty of nonviolent crimes, or even because they are mentally ill and needed some help that they didn't get. And so we're paying more money to keep them in jail than it would cost to get them the help that they need. So there are a lot of issues. The issue of capital punishment. I think you can be a Christian and have different views of capital punishment. But on the other hand, it might be that depending on the circumstances, you might have a different view of capital punishment. In other words, if it becomes quite evident that the view we used to have, that everybody who gets executed deserves to be executed because he has received a fair trial and everything has been done justly and on the up and up and so forth. When we believe that, and it becomes more evident every day that that's not the way our justice system works, because that would be a utopian ideal. Then maybe we need to look at the way the execution system works. In other words, is Texas a more righteous place because it executes more people than anybody else? Or is it possible that a lot of people are executed unrighteously? Anyway, in fact, there were 3 or 4 full pages in the Christian Chronicle just recently on that one issue. So that could be a part of your scrapbook problem too, just talking about our criminal justice system. That was a big problem in the recent presidential debate, and it's going to continue to be a problem. So even if somebody sees this film 4 years from now, we're still going to have problems with our criminal justice system. There was a problem with Luther's concept of the two kingdoms, a very real historical problem, in that Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms was interpreted in such a way that many times Lutherans acquiesced to the rise of Nazism. In other words, if you believe that the government and the governor or the president or the chancellor is a servant of God, and you expect him to protect the rights of people, but after a while you begin to realize that not only is this man not the servant of God, but he's not protecting the rights of anybody. He's not protecting anybody but himself. And that perhaps the way he's going, he may actually be one of the most horrible leaders or rulers in the history of the world. Perhaps Christian ethics should evaluate that and not just say, well, Christians just ought to obey the government. I don't think that's what Luther intended, but that's the way Luther's two-kingdom theory was kind of interpreted by a lot of people. And that had very bad consequences in the 20th century. But anyway, he distinguished between personal self-defense, which he rejected as contrary to Christian love, and the defense of others, which he considered to be an expression of that same love. So in principle, the two-kingdom theory should have been, since it's the defense of others, the two-kingdom theory should have been one by which Lutherans and other Christians in Germany should have been able, on the basis of Christian ethics, to have put a stop to Nazism and Hitlerism before it became unstoppable. After it became unstoppable, then not much you can do about it. Even then, some Lutheran theologians, ministers, were involved in the attempt to assassinate Hitler, because before the war they had been pacifist, and they believed that you should never kill anybody. But as the war went on and they saw the destruction of the Jews and the gypsies and homosexuals and Poles and Russians and a great many Christians in the Nazi Holocaust, they began to realize that it may be the will of God, the command of God, to try to get rid of Hitler. They failed. They failed, and some of them were hanged and executed because they participated in it. But anyway, the defense of others is the only justification for violence or resistance. Violent resistance is the defense of others. A Christian should be so disposed that he will suffer every evil and injustice, not avenge himself, nor bring suit in court, and in nothing make use of secular power and law for himself. When we forcibly defend ourselves, we are behaving in a self-centered and unloving way. When we defend others, however, A Christian may and should seek vengeance, justice, protection, and help, and do what he can toward this. Thereby you govern yourself according to love and suffer no injustice for your neighbor's sake. Yes?
I have a question. It seems that Luther goes directly against natural law in the sense of self-preservation. If self-preservation is part of natural law, then there should be nothing wrong with defending yourself.
Yeah. There's no doubt about that. The Sermon on the Mount is not really in tune with natural law. That doesn't mean that it obliterates natural law, but it transcends natural law. There are a lot of things that are the same way. For instance, one of the great virtues of some of the pagan philosophers and some of the Enlightenment philosophers, one of the great virtues, in fact, probably the virtue that is considered the greatest virtue in pluralistic America is what? What would you say is the virtue that most people today at least talk about being in favor of? How about tolerance? Tolerance is the highest virtue in American life. Lots of us don't live up to tolerance, but tolerance is very politically correct these days. It's a virtue that is politically correct. Well, what Luther would say is that tolerance is a splendid pagan virtue, but it is not enough for a Christian. In other words, a Christian should not merely be tolerant. A Christian should at least be tolerant, but he should not merely be tolerant. And that speaks to your paper on agape or on love, because tolerance would be a part of what agape implied, but agape would transcend tolerance to the point that Christians are not supposed to just tolerate one another. They should at least tolerate one another, but they're not supposed to tolerate one another, and they're not just supposed to tolerate other people. Agape is a more proactive kind of activity than mere tolerance. Now, any good secularist can tell you, well, Christians don't even live up to tolerance, and that's true. You can hear through all the way through history Christians who have not even lived up to the pagan virtue of tolerance. But that what that is an indictment of the Christian failure to take seriously his own ethic, because a Christian who takes seriously his own ethic will be more than tolerant. You understand what I'm saying by more than tolerant? He will actually be proactive in trying to promote the good of the person, not just tolerate them. In America, we, just like every other culture that's ever existed, we have a low tolerance level of people that we consider to be different, people that we consider to be alien, people that we consider to be sinners or whatever. We have a low tolerance level. And that sometimes produces inequities, it produces oppression, it produces sometimes even violence toward people. It produces witch hunts and race bashing and gay bashing and all kinds of things. The hope of secular ethics, secular political correctness in America is that we will be able to raise all Americans' level of tolerance. Well, that's not going to happen. You're not going to raise all Americans' level of tolerance, and you're certainly not going to raise all Americans' level of tolerance to the extent that you would like to see it. That's utopianism. But there are some ethics that could contribute even more to this by requiring their own ethic, which is transcending tolerance. In other words, it may be that not many Christians take seriously their concept of agape. But if they take seriously the concept of the agape, they're going to treat these untolerated people better than they would even if they tolerated them. And that's the ideal, of course, that that almost all Christians fall short of. Just like if you're able to perfectly perform your ethical ideal, then your ethical ideal is not very high. That's why for Christianity, tolerance is not really the highest virtue. That doesn't mean that Christians have always even been tolerant. But for a Christian to be tolerant is not enough from the Christian perspective. Calvin's ethics and the sovereignty of God. Above all, Christian life in Calvin was understood to be a life of faith and faithfulness in response to God's grace. Now, it's important to look at Calvin because when we think of the Reformation, we usually think of Luther because he is the spark plug of the Reformation. He's the Pope called the wild boar in the vineyard. He's a very volatile kind of personality. He's not as systematic a thinker as John Calvin is. But John Calvin's form of the Reformation is the one that had by far the most impact on England, on English-speaking peoples, and on America. If you want to know what is the religion that has had the most impact on America thus far, it is Calvinism. Because when you talk about Calvinism, you're talking about, first of all, the Puritans, the Pilgrims. You're talking about the Reformed people who established New York City. You're talking about the Presbyterians, Scottish Presbyterians, and Irish Presbyterians who were the second great wave. In other words, several of the first waves of American immigrants were Calvinists. They established the universities, they established the school systems, they established the work ethic, they established the language, they established the way of looking at almost everything. And they in turn became intolerant of further waves of immigration, for instance, by Catholics and other people. And one of the reasons why they were intolerant of other immigrations is because the institutions that they had established had a tone of Calvinism. And so they had a hard time relating to Catholicism, even though Catholics and Calvinists are all Christians. You still develop a culture of your own. And the Calvinist culture was basically the original culture of the American colonies, even among Anglicans and Episcopalians, and even among Enlightenment people. Calvinist ethic, the Protestant work ethic, was common not only to Puritan preachers, but to Thomas Jefferson and even Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's sex ethics weren't very Puritan, but his work ethic and and his educational ethic and things like that were Puritan. So what we can say is that since American culture and American education was largely begun by a kind of an injection of Calvinism into American culture at the very beginning, even though it has become largely much more pluralistic and is becoming more pluralistic as we go along, still when people assimilate into American culture, they take on some Calvinist ways of doing things. For instance, American democracy and American capitalism cannot be understood without understanding Calvinism. Calvinists were the first Christians to officially allow money to be lent at interest, which of course is one of the bases of capitalism. The Puritans were the ones who, because of their work ethic, produced wealth, which they did not believe they had the right to consume upon themselves. So if you produce wealth, enough to take care of your family, enough to take care of everybody that you love, and then enough to take care of anybody in the community who needs it, and still have wealth left over, what do you call that? That's capital. That's capital that you can now put into something else. So almost all of the capitalists of the 18th and 19th century were Puritans or the descendants of Puritans. And the Democratic, even though Calvin was not a Democrat in the modern sense of the word, if it weren't for some of the ways in which he understood the relationship between the government to the people, democratic thought as we know it would not have developed. There were other inputs into American democracy, but one of the important inputs was the covenantal theology of Calvinism. So I've already talked about a couple of things that people, because America became ostensibly a very anti-Calvinist culture. If you mention Puritans to Americans, they gag, because they don't realize that, first of all, they have a very non-historical understanding of who the Puritans were and what they did. But they also don't recognize that some of the things in America that we value the highest are things that we got from our Calvinist ancestors. Even almost all the presidents of the United States were educated at Calvinist schools. Even John Kennedy, who was a Roman Catholic, was a Harvard graduate. So economic philosophy, political philosophy, educational philosophy, all kinds of things are these original Calvinist Ivy League schools are the repository of those things. And when John Kennedy ran for president, since he was a Roman Catholic, he had to prove to a great many of Americans that he was more Calvinist in his way of thinking. Now, but the problem is, when we think of Calvinists, we think of predestination, we think of total depravity, we think of puritanical sexual ethics and so forth. And the first thing we need to understand is that we don't understand what those mean. But the second is that, and we're probably more in favor of those than we sometimes think we are. But the second thing is that we don't keep in mind that even though there are some things about Calvinism that we certainly don't want to go back to, there are also certain things about Calvinism that we are very grateful that we have received, which has made American democracy, English democracy, Dutch democracy, since these are all Calvinist countries, different from other kinds of culture. For Calvin, God chooses whom to give his salvation. Indeed, from all time, God has, in the ineffable mystery of the divine will, known who will receive the gift and who will not. Now, that just didn't make sense to Americans. That's what I mean by the fact that Americans have become anti-Calvinist in very significant ways. Americans' conception of salvation has been more influenced by the Enlightenment, and by the Enlightenment view of the human will, and by the Enlightenment view of a number of things, than by the Calvinist view. We just don't think the Calvinist view of salvation is fair. That doesn't decide whether it's true or not. We just don't feel like it's fair. And you can understand that, because Calvin just talked in a way which for him was quite reasonable, because he understood something which is hard, or he believed something which is hard for us to believe, and that is that all human beings deserve to go to hell. And so if even one human being doesn't go to hell, that is a triumph of the grace of God. So from his perspective, human beings shouldn't gripe or fuss about the fact that they're going to hell. If they're going to hell, that's because they deserve to go to hell. Well, we have a hard time thinking that way these days. And so we put a lot more stock in the freedom of the will and in the freedom of choosing. And so our concept of faith is somewhat different. For Calvin, faith meant to respond to the decree of God, to the grace of God. For most of us, including churches that are descendants of the Puritans, like the Baptists and the Presbyterian Church, most of us think that, well, God just kind of puts out these two alternatives and we choose which one. Well, both of these are ways in which Christians have understood the mystery of salvation. It still remains a mystery. You know, our American way of thinking about salvation is certainly more likable, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it really explains everything. And that's what Luther and Calvin and Augustine were trying to explain. If God is gracious God and wants everybody to be saved, why is it that some people are not saved? And each one of them has a slightly different way of explaining why there are some people not saved. Yes?
From the viewpoint of these two authors, of Luther and Calvin, I guess in their belief that man is justified by faith only and not by works, how would they, I guess I'm wondering, how would they address or maybe even reconcile, say, the second chapter of James, which says that faith without works is dead? And, could you tell us how maybe they would examine something like that, how they would address that or answer that?
Yeah. They would interpret it, they're very intelligent people, and they would interpret Paul and James as being compatible. And they would do it, first of all, by saying that you have to understand that exegetically, that faith in one verse may mean something slightly different from faith in another, or that works in one verse may mean something different from works in the other. Luther, in fact, hated to have to go through all this explanation, so he didn't like the book of James. He said the book of James was a strawy epistle. That is, it didn't really clearly state the apostolic doctrine. He left it in the Bible, but he wasn't a fundamentalist literalist about the Bible. He thought that Paul explained the gospel better than James did. But it's quite possible, and Christian theologians have over the years shown the compatibility of these, because one of the problems with the doctrine of justification by grace, actually it's more properly doctrine of justification by grace through faith. Sometimes we shorten it to salvation by faith. And when we do that, sometimes we're thinking of faith as within itself a human work. That's a lot of what I hear in preaching today. Faith is kind of a human work. But for Luther, the better way to say it is, and for Calvin, by grace through faith. That's actually a quotation from Paul. We're justified by grace through faith. That means that 100% of our justification comes from the mercy of God. None of it comes from our own activity. Even our faith does not save us, except that it accepts the salvation. Faith is the acceptance of the salvation that God gives as a free gift. One of the problems modern people have is, for instance, when Luther gave out his doctrine of justification by grace through faith without works, and talked about the bondage of the will. That is, the human will is so bound that it cannot accept the grace of God. It cannot choose the grace of God. It cannot choose the good. So God has to come in, so to speak, and unloosen the human will by the power of His grace and the Spirit, before even the will can be directed back toward God. Well, the great humanist Erasmus, the Roman Catholic humanist Erasmus, really balked at that idea. And so he debated with Luther on the freedom of the will. And I think part of the problem is that Erasmus and other people who just dismiss Luther's concept of the will are doing it for what I call pedagogical grounds. You know what pedagogical means? It means the way you're supposed to teach. It's very difficult to teach as radical a gospel as Paul preaches to ordinary people, because the question immediately comes up, then you don't have to do good in order to be saved. Well, that's not the problem. What Luther and Calvin are trying to say is, when you're talking about the basis of salvation, the will not do it. Human effort will not do it. But when you're talking about human effort, Christians should put forth more human effort than anybody. But they have to first be put into proper relationship. In other words, they first have to be justified. Because they can work all their lives and never do enough good works to be justified. So what Luther says is that we want to be very clear on what the starting point is. The starting point is that God loosens our will, gives us justification, gives us righteousness, and then on the basis of that, we can do God's will. But we can't get up one morning and say, well, I'm going to do God's will for a few years and then be saved. That's not the way it works. And a lot of people who critique Luther and Paul critique them as if they are what are called antinomians. That is, that they are against law. Paul is not against law. Every time Paul, in fact, Calvin and Luther both have statements about the uses of the law. The law is extremely useful. It's not useful for saving us, since we can't keep it. And the only way the law can save us is if we keep it. But the law is very useful. Calvin, for instance, on page 118 of Woggeman says, There are three uses of the law. First use is as evidence to us of our moral powerlessness apart from the grace of God. So, when you read the law, the purpose for reading the law, original purpose for reading the law, is not to learn what to do to be saved, because doing what the law commands cannot save you because you can't do it. So the first purpose of the law is to show how powerless we are. That's from Luther and Calvin's perspective, the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount. It's not to tell us what we have to do to be saved, because we can't do that. It's to tell us that we are powerless to save ourselves. We are murderers. We are thieves. As Luther would put it, you are not a thief because you steal. That's kind of an Aristotelian view. You steal because you are a thief. And so what has to happen is that your being a thief has to be erased. It has to be, your nature has to be redeemed from being a thief. And only then can you not be a thief. So the first purpose of the law is just to point out how far we fall short of God's will. The second is it's an external constraint upon the behavior of the wicked. In other words, if you're not, say, born again or a new creation, then if you do not have the Spirit of God, then your intentionality is not to do the will of God. So one purpose of the law is to point out to wicked people what it is to do God's will. It is to not commit adultery. It's not to kill. And the third is as a teaching tool for the believers, so that they may learn more thoroughly each day the nature of the Lord's will to which they aspire. So what you need to understand is that this is a theological, this is a question of soteriology. That is a question of salvation, not a question of ethics. First, you have to be saved in the Christian perspective before you can then talk about ethics. First, you have to believe and accept the righteousness of God before you can then start on the journey of being righteous. Now, a lot of people, including some of the original readers of Paul and some of the original hearers of Luther, like Erasmus, are like the Catholic Counter-Reformation. They just thought of Luther as an antinomian, as crazy, because he didn't tell people that you had to refrain from committing adultery to be saved. Well, Luther didn't believe that Christians ought to commit adultery, but he didn't believe that they could save themselves by refusing to commit adultery. Because they can't really do that. They could only save themselves by receiving the goodness, the grace and the love of God. And then when somebody asks Paul or Luther, what should I be doing as a Christian? Well, one thing you should not be doing is committing adultery. See? So he still got the law. But the law has a different relationship to salvation. And if we can get that switched, all day long I've talked about switching. If we can get that switched, then we can understand a little bit. We still may not agree with the radicality of Luther or Calvin. And I certainly wouldn't use Calvin's language today because it's just totally misunderstood. Some theologians even suggest that we shouldn't even use the word sin anymore because it's been so depleted of its original meaning that you're actually miscommunicating to people when you use the word sin. That may be even true of the word grace, because people think of grace as a kind of religious idea that you hear about when you go to church, and the biblical understanding of grace is that it is something essential to human life. It's essential to fulfill human life. So, in that light, then, we have to understand that Paul, Luther, Calvin have a radical ethic because they have a radically different idea of how we get into a position to be ethical. Okay, next time we'll carry on.